cells live a pretty stressful life. Okay, they're these tiny little cells, and they're constantly at rapid speed being rushed through the blood vessels. Okay, in a red blood cell's life, it will travel about 700 miles. That's a lot. And remember, we're constantly cramming it through these microscopic vessels. So we take something this size and we say, no, and we twist it up into this tiny little bunch and shove it through a tiny vessel and then keep it bursting on its way. Right? That's a stressful life. Can it repair itself? So when something goes wrong in it, it's not like it can just patch up the wall, right? It can't make proteins. It doesn't do self-repairs very well. So what that means is that we constantly have to make new ones. Okay? They're constantly wearing out, and we need to take those worn out red blood cells and get rid of them and make new ones. First, we'll sit here and we'll talk a little bit about how it is that we get rid of those red blood cells, okay? How it is that we either recycle them or get rid of them as waste or both, what we do with worn out red blood cells. So about 1% of your circulating red blood cells wear out and are replaced every day. That equates to millions, okay? Actually millions per second. Millions of red blood cells every second are being recycled, gotten rid of, and remade. So this is constantly occurring all over your body, impacts a lot of different things, super important. When a red blood cell starts to wear out, we rely on macrophages in the liver, spleen, and bone marrow to help us get rid of that worn out red blood cell and recycle its components. Okay? What does macrophage mean? Like, really literally. Big eater, right? To eat, phage or phage is to eat. So a macrophage is a big eater. I always describe them as Pac-Man, right? They're the ones that roam around the body and they just chomp stuff up. Anything that's abnormal, that shouldn't be there, your cells that are old and dead, bacteria, invaders, whatever shouldn't be there, the macrophage engulfs it and digests it, right? Breaks it down. So when we look at recycling our old, worn out red blood cells, we rely on macrophages. Again, this happens mainly in the liver, spleen, and bone marrow. When we talk about blood vessels, we'll talk about why. We have really special vessels there that allow this to happen. So typically, or what we want to happen is for the macrophage to be able to engulf the old, worn out red blood cell before it ruptures. Okay, rupturing is called hemolysis. Think like lice. When you lyse something, you break it apart, right? We talked about that a lot in AP1. Lysing something is to break it apart. Heme, like hemoglobin. Hematopoiesis, right? That's referring to the blood. So hemolysing is the red blood cell rupturing. We want the macrophage to be monitoring the red blood cells, and when it sees with a little warning, right, like this guy's getting old, he's worn out, he's not doing good, we want the macrophage to engulf him before he hemolyzes, before he bursts. The reason for that is then the macrophage can control all of those ingredients or all of the parts of the macrophage, and we can more efficiently recycle the good stuff. Sometimes the red blood cell ruptures first. You know, it might be in another part of the body when this happens. There might not be a macrophage near, or maybe a lot of red blood cells are bursting at once, and we don't have enough macrophages. So sometimes the red blood cell just bursts before a macrophage can get to it. In that case, right after it bursts, it starts breaking down. So the hemoglobin components start to break apart and break down. The only way we can recycle the components is if, or what we want to happen rather, is for the macrophage to grab up and engulf as many of those components as possible. Okay, so the macrophage can like take up that hemoglobin that's already ruptured, but if it gets to your kidneys first, you're just gonna pee it out. Okay, so the macrophage has to get to it before it gets to your kidneys, otherwise you're gonna lose those components in the urine and you're not gonna be able to process them and recycle them, okay? So this is what we want to happen, and this is what typically happens unless there's some sort of a disease process occurring. So we're going to talk a lot about this process of, you know, the way that the macrophage breaks it down, what happens to all of the products or the parts of the hemoglobin. And the reason for that is, again, it's important. We see results of this show up in numerous different disease processes. And by the time we get to the end, you'll be like, oh, I didn't know that, because I'm sure you guys have all heard of like jaundice, right? Okay. So this is going to relate to that. All right. So the macrophage in the liver, spleen, bone marrow engulfs the old red blood cell and it starts to break it down. We recycle the good stuff we can use, we get rid of the wastes that we can't use. So we see that the proteins, right, those 4 subunits get broken down into their individual amino acids. We release those amino acids into the bloodstream and they're recycled, right? We can use them. We use the same amino acids to make every protein, right? We just put different ones in different orders. So we can use those amino acids, we don't want to waste them. The macrophage just breaks them down, releases them into the blood, and other cells can use them, or they can go back to the bone marrow to make new hemoglobin. Okay, so we recycle those. Then we're left with the hemoglobin, right? We had the subunits, and then we had hemoglobin, which was iron, and then all the other molecules in the heme. So with the hemoglobin, we separate the iron from the rest of the heme. Okay, we pull those apart. 2 different things are happening with those. The iron is recycled. Okay, again, iron is useful. We need it in order to make these red blood cells. As many wear out, we've got to replace. And most people don't get enough iron. So we don't want to get rid of that iron. We want to reuse it. So we send that iron back to the bone marrow to make new red blood cells. The only caveat, the only important thing here is that free iron on its own is reactive. And it causes problems if it travels around the body by itself. So we utilize a transport protein to kind of grab that iron, carry it back where it needs to go without letting it get in any problems on the way. So we use something called transferrin. And you guys work in pharmacies or doctor's offices? What do we call iron? Like prescription iron, what's it typically called?
Ferrous sulfate.
Beautiful, ferrous sulfate. So look, ferrin, transferring or transporting the ferrous sulfate. You're transporting the iron. Transferrin is one of those plasma proteins, one of the transport proteins in the blood, grabs onto the iron, takes it where it needs to go, and drops it off. Okay, but again, we recycle that iron. Now we're left with the rest of the heme. The rest of the heme we do not recycle. Okay, the rest of the heme, it's a few nitrogen and a bunch of carbon, and we get rid of it. It's a waste product. And the way that we get rid of this is important. So initially, the heme is converted to this is all in the macrophage. And in the macrophage, the heme is converted to a substance called biliverdin. Okay, it happens to be green. The colors actually do matter, we'll find out. But biliverdin happens to be a green substance. That biliverdin, still inside the macrophage, gets converted to something called bilirubin. If you work in the healthcare field, you've probably heard the term bilirubin before. So biliverdin gets converted to bilirubin. Bilirubin happens to be, can anybody tell me what color? Yellow. Excellent. Yellow. Okay, the bilirubin gets released into the bloodstream. Okay, so the macrophage takes the heme, converts it to biliverdin to bilirubin, and then releases it out into the blood. And that is a waste. We want to get rid of that bilirubin. We don't want to leave it in our body. Okay, we'll talk about how we get rid of it in the next slide. This biliverdin, this green, this is why, like, you know when you get a bruise, how that bruised area first, right off the bat, it's really red, right, as the blood leaks out of the bloodstream. And then it turns like bluish purple, right, as that blood sits there. Then the blood cells start to break down over time and release the hemoglobin components, and they start to break down. That heme gets converted to biliverdin, which is green. You've all seen your bruises fade to green before, right? That's what's happening. And then it pales to a yellow as that process continues, and then eventually all the wastes get carried away. But that's why that's happening. So let's talk more about bilirubin. And then we've got like a nice picture we'll talk through, and you guys can kind of talk me through the process to make sure that you're good with it. So remember, we're breaking down our old red blood cells, right? The macrophage took the heme, broke it down to biliverdin to bilirubin, and it pushed the bilirubin out into the blood. Now we've got this waste, right? This bad stuff, this bilirubin that's a waste, we need to get rid of it. It's floating through the bloodstream. We get rid of it in the liver. Okay, so the blood is flowing through the body, it flows to the liver, and the liver is responsible for cleaning the bilirubin out of our blood and getting rid of it. The way that it does this is via the bile. We haven't done digestive yet, but the liver takes wastes from the blood and it puts them in something called bile, and it ejects that bile into your intestines. Okay, if you follow your intestines all the way to the end, what comes out? Poop, right? Feces. So the wastes come out in the poop. That's where the bilirubin, well, it gets broken down more, but it should leave the body in the poop. Okay, so the liver takes it out of the blood, puts it into the intestines. In the intestines, we break it down a little bit more. We break it down to urobilins and stercobilins. The stercobilins stay in the intestine and come out in the poop. The urobilins actually, and this is so strange, I don't know why this happens, it seems really silly. It's probably related to osmolarity of the urine. But the urobilins get reabsorbed from the intestines and then they get excreted in the urine. I'm not gonna ask you about that, but just so if you see that somewhere, you don't get wait a minute, she said poop, why is this going out in the urine? A little bit of it does actually get reabsorbed and then put into the urine. But for the most part, biliverdin goes to bilirubin. Bilirubin goes into the blood. The liver cleans it out of the blood by excreting it in the bile into the intestines. It leaves the body as poop. Right? That's how we get rid of the waste. So, jaundice. When someone has jaundice or is jaundiced, what color do they look? Yellow, right? You first see it normally in the eyes. The whites of the eyes are a really easy place to see that yellowing or that jaundice, but eventually it'll go through the whole skin. And I've seen, in the ICU, I've seen patients that almost look like a highlighter. It's intense when someone's really, really severely jaundiced. But this is a yellow skin tone. And the reason that people can appear yellow is because of a bilirubin buildup. Right? Our red blood cells are constantly being broken down. So we're constantly putting bilirubin into the bloodstream. And what do we rely on to take it out, to get rid of it? The liver. So if the liver's not functioning right, that bilirubin is going to build up. And if you have enough of a pigment build up in your body, you turn that color. Right? When we did integumentary, we said eat enough carrots, you can turn orange. Right? If enough bilirubin builds up, you can turn yellow. And this is really dangerous. It's not just a visual thing with the carotene. It's very dangerous. So you get a yellow skin tone when the bilirubin builds up. So this is associated, fill this in, with an immature or failing liver. Okay, so preemies. Premature babies very frequently are jaundiced. Not a huge deal in them. But premature babies have an immature liver, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time for the liver to catch up with the recycling of the red blood cells. So very frequently, babies, especially if they're premature, will be jaundiced. Typically, we just hydrate them, and then also sun UV therapy. Sun can actually help to break that bilirubin up and can kind of stimulate that process. Failing liver, so hepatitis. Hepatitis, any type of liver failure. If it gets severe, then you can have jaundice occur because the bilirubin is going to start building up. You'll also see it if there's, or you can see it if there's a blocked bile duct. Those are just the tubes that take the bile from the liver into the intestines, right? So it's like the roadway. If you block the roadway, the car can't get through. So if you block that bile duct, the bile gets backed up. So the bilirubin gets backed up, and it just kind of backs everything up. Hey, that's kind of an easy one to fix, though. We do have a couple other conditions related to hemoglobin and kind of hemoglobin recycling. Hemoglobinuria and hematuria. Urea means what? What do you think of? Urine, right? So we're talking about hemoglobin in the urine or blood in the urine. And we can see both. We can see whole red blood cells in the urine, or we can see the hemoglobin, the breakdown products in the urine. And we'll see that for different reasons. So the first one, hemoglobinuria, is when the hemoglobin breakdown products. So not whole red blood cells, but the hemoglobin, like the heme and the amino acids and the iron, all of those breakdown components, the little pieces or building blocks show up in the urine. That typically happens when we have excess hemolysis. What's hemolysis?
Bursting of the red blood cells.
Excellent, bursting of the red blood cells. So remember we said typically they get engulfed by the macrophages, right? Typically your red blood cells aren't bursting like crazy everywhere to where the macrophages can't keep up and engulf and recycle those components. So if your red blood cells start bursting and you've got a ton of hemolysis occurring, your macrophages can't keep up. So we end up just peeing out those hemoglobin components instead of recycling the amino acids and recycling the iron and converting the heme into bilirubin. All of those things just stay as they are, and the building blocks get filtered out into the urine. So that could occur in like a transfusion reaction. Like if you transfuse the wrong type of blood to somebody, we're going to start lysing those blood cells because they look foreign. They look like they shouldn't be there. In some types of anemia, like there's hemolytic anemia. I won't ask you this because I didn't write it down for you, but like hemolytic anemia, you'll have hemolysis, hemolysis start occurring like crazy, and you'll see hemoglobinuria. So the difference here is that here we're not seeing the breakdown components. We're not seeing the building blocks. Instead, we're seeing entire red blood cells. That shouldn't be in the urine because a red blood cell is huge. Remember, we said it's like 280 million hemoglobin. So it's much bigger than just the hemoglobin is. And that shouldn't get filtered out at your kidneys. Again, think of your kidneys, they're like a filter. The blood goes through and some stuff gets pushed out into the urine. So if you have a filter and all of a sudden huge stuff is making it through the filter, you've got to think something's wrong with that filter, right? And that's what happens here. We'll see that if your kidneys are damaged for some reason, all of a sudden really big things like whole cells will start showing up in the urine, and that's not a good thing. So that could be because of kidney damage, or sometimes it's because you're bleeding from your urinary tract. So like if you think, okay, that's my kidney, and I've got these tubes that carry urine down to my bladder, right? And then I've got a tube that carries urine out. If the problem is at the kidney, then the kidney will be letting these big cells through, right? And you'll see big cells in the urine when the urine comes out. But also you could see red blood cells in the urine if, say, I damaged my bladder wall. There are vessels there. So if I damage my bladder wall, then the blood can seep out there and I can still see red blood cells. It's not from the kidneys, it's because I damaged right here. Or you could damage your urethra, like a severe urinary tract infection. Sometimes you'll see red blood cells. Okay. All right, so red blood cell recycling. Does it feel okay? Yeah, I kind of want you guys to know like the key points here. And again, because it relates to the pathophysiology, like it relates to the diseases that you're going to see. So it is important. All right, so what cell is responsible for recycling red blood cells? Good, the macrophage. Where does that occur? Mostly, yes, good. Mostly occurs in the liver, spleen, and bone marrow. So here we see our old red blood cell. And the macrophage is going to engulf it, and it's going to break it down. Remember, we have the subunits, right, the proteins. We've got the iron, and then we've got the rest of the heme. What happens to the subunits? The proteins. They get broken down to amino acids. Are amino acids wastes or nutrients? Nutrients. Right? Amino acids are good. We use them. That's why we eat protein, right? So we recycle them, right? So the protein got broken, or the subunits got broken down to amino acids. We release those into the blood and we use them again, right? We recycle them. Here you see them being used to make more red blood cells, but they could go to other cells along the way. Like they're just amino acids. They could be used for anything. And then that leaves us with the iron and the rest of the heme. So the iron, do we recycle iron or get rid of it as a waste? We recycle it, right? It's useful. We need it to make more red blood cells. So we send the iron into the blood and we send it back to the marrow and we use it to make more red blood cells. We recycle it. What's the caveat there? Do we just ship the iron on its way? No, it's naughty, right? It needs a babysitter. Who do you send with the iron? Transferrin. Excellent, right? That's the transport. Sorry, I love my analogies. I make like cells into humans, and they think and they talk and they're naughty and they're babysitters. But that makes sense in my head. So, right. So we need the transferrin to take the iron to the bone marrow, right? That's the transfer protein. And then again, we recycle it. The rest of this heme, what do we break it down to first? Bilirubin. What color is that? Green. The bilirubin gets broken down into what? What color is bilirubin? Yellow. Are we in the macrophage still? Are we in the bloodstream? Are we in the liver? Where are we at right now? In the macrophage still, right? So heme, bilirubin. Then the bilirubin leaves the macrophage and goes into the bloodstream. Where does the bilirubin end up getting cleaned out of the bloodstream? In the liver. Right? The liver is responsible for taking that waste, that bilirubin, out of the bloodstream. And where does it put it? Into the bile, right? And where does the bile go? Into the intestines. It goes into the small intestine first, and then it makes its way to the large intestine. Remember I said we still break that down more. The bilirubin gets broken down. The urobilins get sent into the urine. The stercobilins get eliminated in the feces. But the point is, we do not recycle it, right? We get rid of it. What happens in liver failure? Jaundice. What is jaundice? Why are you yellow? Because the bilirubin builds up, and bilirubin's yellow. Good. So that happens in liver failure, right? Like hepatitis. If we block a bile duct, what other patient population is jaundice really common in? Preemies, right? Babies, preemies. Good. Good job, guys. So that's it for red blood cell recycling. No more. You did it. We'll talk a little bit about red blood cell production.